The Powerhouse acknowledges the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians and the first astronomers of the land the Sydney Observatory is situated on. We pay our respects and seek guidance from their continuous connection to this place and to the sky country above us. On Time is a Powerhouse series recorded live at Sydney Observatory. We explore our experience of time over 4 conversations, weaving science, philosophy, and story. We're asking not just what time is, but how it governs our sense of self and what shifts when we understand it differently. I'm Rachael Hocking, a Warlpiri woman, journalist and educator. I'll be guiding us through these conversations where you will meet the thinkers and storytellers I had the privilege of yarning with over the cycles and seasons of 2025. Our experience of time is anything but uniform and is something we can experience in profoundly different ways. In this conversation on measured time with philosopher Kristie Miller and content creator Aslan Pahari, we examine how different beings perceive time. We explore the patterns through which humans make sense of time and how cultures develop different ways of orienting themselves in relation to past and future. We trace how memory and imagination work together and how our preferences toward what has been or what is coming quietly shape the choices we make every day. Professor Kristie Miller is the Challis Professor of Philosophy at the University of Sydney and co-director of the Interdisciplinary Centre for Time. Her work explores the structure of time, how physics and philosophy intersect, and how humans experience temporal direction, memory, and the flow of experience. Aslan Pahari is a presenter and content creator whose widely followed work in anthropology, history, and tradition examines how cultures imagine the world, how ideas travel across communities, and how complex concepts can be made accessible to broad audiences. So Aslan, small question. When did you first become aware of time? Not as a clock, but as an experience.
I'd say as far back as I could understand the idea of birth and death, I probably had some idea of time.
And so for you, Kristie, as somebody who has dedicated their professional life to trying to research time, where did that fascination begin?
Well, time is a kind of central topic in philosophy generally. So it was something I just encountered as an undergraduate. And I guess one of the reasons that I ended up moving into it as a kind of area of expertise is it's one of the few areas where you get a kind of intersection of a bunch of disciplines. So physics, philosophy, psychology, it's an unusual combination actually. And I really like sort of working at that intersection. And I'm very interested generally in thinking about how the world is in itself, sort of in the metaphysics and the science, and then how we fit into that world. And so time is a very natural place to be drawn to because it really has those two aspects. There really is this question, like, what is time like in and of itself? And then there's this other question, like, how do we experience time? How do we live our lives as sort of temporal beings? And I'm just fascinated by all of the above.
And so when we talk about how we experience time, Aslan, in your research, you have many conversations with many interesting people from different cultural backgrounds. How have you found their experience of time differing to your own or to what you thought was a standard experience of time?
This is a great question. Growing up in the West and being from a Muslim background in Pakistan, our concept of time, the way we perceive time, has always been linear. There's a starting point and there's an ending point, right? But now that I'm getting into learning about dharmic faiths like Hinduism, Buddhism, there's often this discussion of cyclical time, right? But what does that mean? Does that mean that we're going to be experiencing today at another point in the future? Or is it referring to something else? How does it differ from linear time here?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think there are a couple of things we might want to distinguish there. One question you might be asking is, what would it be for time in itself to genuinely be cyclical? So, I mean, I guess this is a natural way of sort of thinking about time as a fourth dimension, which is just this one plane. From your internal perspective, you are always moving forward, but you end up back where you were. And so there's no well-defined earlier and later than, because any two events will be both earlier and later than one another. That seems like that's a way things could be. I'm not sure that that's what people mean when they talk about cyclical time. I think sometimes what people are talking about is a sense that they have that how they keep track of time and how they are sort of living in time and experiencing time is by measuring things that are cyclical in nature. Seasonality would be the very natural one, especially for people thousands and thousands of years ago. Obviously, they didn't have calendars, they didn't have iPhones pinging them. What are they keeping track of? And also, what really matters to them? Well, what really matters is seasons, especially if you're an agrarian society. You want to know, like, when do I need to plant my stuff? When do I need to pick my stuff? So seasonality, of course, is cyclical because you go through the seasons and then you go back and you're starting back at the beginning of your seasons again. So sometimes I think when people talk about cyclical time, what they really mean is that their experiences are very saliently integrated with the way in which there are lots of things that are cyclical. So there's, seasonality. There's also the day is cyclical, right? So, you go through a day, you have a night, and then you end up with the morning again. Lots of our experiences are like that. And when people talk about cyclical time, I'm never actually sure quite what they have in mind. Are they really thinking this is what time is like? Or is the claim something more like our experiences are interconnected with something that is in time but is cyclical in the sense that it keeps happening over and over again.
Right. I've learned so much.
I wanted to quote you, Kristie, speaking about direction and time. You say it's often thought by philosophers that it seems to creatures like us as though time has a direction and as though there is some deep and objective difference between what is future and what is past. What do you mean?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of philosophical theories that try and capture this idea that there's something objectively different about past, present, and future. And what's more, this idea that not just that the present is kind of special, but also that in some sense we're moving through time. The present is now, but in a second the present's going to be this now. And things that were once present have kind of genuinely become past, and things that were future have kind of become present. And a lot of philosophers have thought that that's a very intuitive way of kind of thinking about time, and this idea that we are moving through time or that time is kind of flowing past us. There's these objective facts about which moment really is, the genuine real present one that really divides reality into past and future. That's one of the models of time that we find in amongst philosophy, which is now a very controversial model, the extent to which metaphysical models should capture that. But one question we might ask, which tries to probe how people are thinking about and feeling about time, is something like, without thinking, just point in the direction of the future, go for it. A lot of people in our culture will point in front of them. Some people will point to the right. So some people are thinking of the temporal axis as kind of running left to right, where left is like back there and right is the future. And a lot of people will think of the future as kind of in front and the past as behind. Most people who've grown up in the West, if you ask them to draw a timeline on a piece of paper, they're going to draw a line, and you say to them, like, put events on the timeline. They're naturally going to put at one end the Big Bang, and they're going to fill in some dinosaurs and stuff, and they're going to sort of populate it left to right. That picture then naturally translates. If you then ask someone to sort of gesture, if they've got that sort of timeline-y view in mind, they're going to imagine themselves sort of on the timeline, and then they're going to point to the left for the past, because like that's the direction that the Big Bang is in. That's my guess about that.
Do you know if there are cultures that, point the opposite direction when they're talking about the future?
If we were in a very different cultural context, the fingers would have been doing totally different things. So there are various cultures who will point in the reverse way. So some people will say that in front is the past and that way is the future. Sociologists and anthropologists have sort of asked people like, well, why is that? Why are you pointing in that direction? And what they say is actually very sensible, which is something like, well, look, the past is the place that I have knowledge of. So like I know what happened yesterday. If you ask me what I had for breakfast, like, yeah, I can bring it to mind. In some sense, I can see. So of course, it's the direction I'm looking in. And of course, the future is over there. I don't know what's going to happen. I can't see it. So obviously, I'm facing into the past and away from the future. Whereas in Western cultures, usually people are pointing to the right as the future and the left as the past. And probably that's an artifact of the direction people write in. Either of them seem like perfectly sensible things to say, but in a very kind of culturally embedded way of gesturing.
Why this makes me curious is I'm going to run an experiment when I get back to Canberra, where my dad is. He grew up not writing at all, so he has no education. So I'm going to give him the options of either left or right, and I'm going to ask him which way he points. I think he's going to point the direction we typically point just because he lives here and he's had to learn to write over time. But I'm still curious.
And what about you?
Honestly, the future is to the right for me. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to test your memory and your imagination now a little bit, Aslan.
Not after work.
Yeah, sorry. In the work that you do, does imagining the past feel the same as imagining the future, especially when you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes, which is something I imagine you do a lot?
I think it's quite different from my perspective, just because we have more information about the world, their culture, etc., to build whatever it is they're in. Whereas when I'm imagining the future, there's so many possibilities, right?
It takes a bunch of different forks. Yeah. And so, Kristie, what does this sort of backwards-forwards capacity in our memories? Are these distinct abilities?
There are obviously differences between the two, but I think it would be very natural initially to think they're just two very different things, right? Okay, there's memory, bringing to mind what happened yesterday, and then there's kind of imaginatively thinking what might happen tomorrow. It's very natural to think one is sort of retrieving information about the way that things have really been, and the other is this very imaginative task where you're really thinking like all of the different things that could happen. There's pretty good psychological evidence that really there's a fundamental underlying set of mechanisms that allows you to do both of these things. And I guess what that tells you is that memory is not really this function of just kind of retrieving stuff that's in a filing cabinet where you just go into the cabinet and you pull out the thing that says what happened yesterday. It's a much more kind of imaginative re-engagement with what happened. What you find is that people who have deficits will typically have deficits, both pastward episodic memory and forwardsward. And you'll see them in both in people's capacity to kind of imaginatively engage in the way things would go, but also in their memory capacities, because there's really this kind of fundamental thing we do, which is sort of imagining from the internal perspective. What you're doing in either of these cases is bringing to mind some imaginative way that things could be. And in one case, it's kind of a memory state, and in the other case, it's kind of a future-directed state that hasn't happened. But the underlying thing of kind of being able to bring that to mind and imagining yourself in that way that things are, that's kind of one fundamental capacity that is underlying both of those things, which is why I guess you find deficits in both.
Right. Am I correct in saying this is what you refer to as mental time travel?
Yeah, so the capacity to kind of, from a first-person perspective, re-experience stuff that has happened in the past, and from a first-person perspective, kind of project yourself into the future and imagine how things might go. Yeah, that's sort of known as mental time travel.
It's very cool. How are you starting to understand this capacity in non-human animals?
And there's been a lot of research in this area, lots of data in the higher birds, because of course they're very intelligent, but across lots of different animals, from those that are more similar to us, like chimpanzees, to those that are quite dissimilar. One of my colleagues works with bees. I've got no idea how you probe bees' capacity for mental time travel. It's still kind of controversial exactly how to understand what's going on in those animals. So is what they're doing more or less like what sort of you and I are doing when we remember what happened last week and we imagine what might happen next week, and on the basis of our memories we kind of make plans for what we're going to do? Is that what's kind of happening in birds and squirrels and so forth? Or is it something a little bit different? That's some of the questions that some collaborators and I are interested in. We want to know, to what extent are the kind of mechanisms that animals are using more or less the same ones that you and I are? To what extent are they a bit different? How does kind of human capacity build on some of those things? It's going to be controversial how to test something like mental time travel in animals, because I guess there's kind of alternative explanations. So obviously it could just be a socially learned thing where it's passed down from parent to child, which is something like, look, when this thing happens to you, i.e. you get injured, you should put this stuff on you. So it doesn't have to require that they're kind of projecting into the future, thinking something like, oh gosh, if I don't put this chewed up stuff on, this thing could go septic and that would be bad for me. It could just be a fairly simple learned response. And I guess what that tells you is that it's hard in animals to figure out what's going on sort of under the hood. But in humans, you can like ask them questions. How did you go about this? Did you remember this? There's a bunch of things that you can do. Even if you operationalize something in terms of behavior, you can then talk to your subjects and say, okay, like tell me what was going on there. Whereas when you've got orangutans or chimps or something, all you've got is the experimental setup and the data that you get. And then that's sort of where the controversy comes in, because one bunch of people are going to say, look, given these results, say of birds, caching various different things, that's a reason to think they have this kind of mental time travel, because they're keeping those things for later. And what's more, they're going back to them later. So they must remember where they put them. And surely there was a reason for putting them there, i.e. that they knew that later they were going to be hungry, right? So that's a very natural story to tell, is that there's some forward planning here. You figure out what you want to get, you collect it, you put it somewhere safe, later you come back. It's actually pretty sophisticated behavior. But there's always going to be stories that explain that without appealing to those capacities. That's the sort of difficulty you have when you're working with animals and comparative psychologists, is trying to figure out what's actually going on.
Okay, so if we move to some of your recent research then on what you call time bias, and you authored a book, The Normative Status of Time Bias. Can you start by just telling us a bit more about this research, and maybe you have a way to describe exactly what you're talking about to bring our audience into this kind of loopy concepts?
Usually we say that time biases are preferences for where in time stuff is located for you to have. So that's not going to sound very illuminating. So here's a little story, and I'm going to ask you what your preferences are. And then I'm going to tell you whether, on the basis of those preferences, you will turn out to count as being time biased, or what we sometimes call as time neutral. So I want you to imagine you're in a hospital and you wake up, you're kind of groggy, and what you know is that there's a surgery that you have to have. So you have to be awake for the surgery, which means you have to experience the pain. They can't give you pain relief. So you wake up and in the moment you're kind of groggy and a bit out of it, and you don't remember whether you've already had the surgery and you're kind of waking up from the horrible after effects, or whether you still have to have the surgery. So you're in this moment of not knowing which predicament you're in. You see a nurse walking past and you say, did I already have this surgery or not? And he tells you that he doesn't know. The first iteration of this thought experiment, you've got two surgeries that are equally painful, equally bad, same risks, same downstream kind of consequences. And what you're asked in this little scenario is to try and figure out what you would prefer to be the case. So would you prefer, you send the nurse off to consult the records so that he can come back and tell you, did you already have the surgery or not? And you're supposed to be mulling over in this moment whether you'd prefer that he comes back and says, okay, you had it already, or you're still about to have it. I assume that the obvious answer here is you would all prefer that you learn that you already had the surgery. Now, I just want to tweak this a little bit. So I want you to imagine that when the nurse comes by, he's like, look, I'm not completely on top of my job here, but I can tell you the following things. So either you just had the surgery, and if you did, it was 10 hours. It was the worst, like the longest, most painful surgery we've done in this hospital under these conditions. Like, mate, whew, that's option one. Or it can be that you still have to have the surgery, in which case it will only be the 1 hour long painful surgery. So now I want you to think again. You're in the same sort of predicament. He goes off to figure out which of these is the case. What do you prefer that he tells you when you come back? So do you prefer to learn that you just had 10 hours of painful surgery? Or do you prefer to learn that you're just about to have 1 painful hour of surgery? So if you preferred 10 painful hours to 1 painful hour, on the grounds that the 10 hours are in the past, not in the future, that makes you time biased. Means basically that you have a preference for where things are, which is sensitive to the kind of the temporal location itself. Because I take it that you're not having that preference because you just really love pain. So I'm assuming that the reason that you preferred 10 hours to 1 hour is that the 10 hours is past. And that's in fact what we find in our various studies. So in some sense, when you ask people this question, it seems to people very obvious. Of course, you should prefer the 10 hours to the 1 hour because it's in the past. People who have the other preference might say, what is wrong with you? You're choosing 10 hours of pain over 1 hour of pain. Think about it. It's still you, whoever's getting the pain. The only difference is kind of where yourself who's feeling the pain happens to be located in time. And I think people's intuitions are really strong in both camps. So people who think something like, look, it shouldn't matter where the pain is. What matters is like how much of it there is. Those people have what we call time neutral preferences. People who are like, no, if pains are in the past, they're somehow less bad. So you should prefer more pain in the past to less pain in the future. They have time bias preferences. Of course, there are reasons to prefer a past surgery to a future surgery, because if you're here, you obviously survive. But the case is meant to be the only thing that you're taking into consideration here is how long is the surgery and where is it temporally located. So the risks are meant to be the same. So in our research, we try and hold fixed all of those other things that are associated with where things are in time, like probability, and people still show the same preference, which is that about 80% of people will prefer the 10 hours to the 1 hour as long as it's in the past, which is a really interesting response.
So, Kristie, what about if we're being asked about other people? Is there research in that?
Yes, a colleague hypothesized. So when he consulted his own intuitions, he thought of himself, look, if I wake up in the hospital, I really care where this surgery is, like from a first-person perspective. But he's thinking, look, even if it's someone I really care about, so imagine that I'm making preferences over the surgery of like my wife or my child or something. He thinks to himself, look, in that case, I just prefer that it's the least painful amount of surgery. If I think about my child and I'm thinking, does she have a 10-hour operation on Tuesday or a 1 hour operation on Thursday? Obviously, I prefer for her that she just has the 1 hour surgery, right? I'm just trying to minimize pain. That seemed very reasonable to him. And he thought that that would be a very general response, that when people were forming preferences over other people's experiences in time, that they would be time neutral in those cases. And he thought that was kind of important in various ways. So we thought, well, that's a really interesting hypothesis. Let's just find out people's actual preferences. So we have some research on that. And he turned out to be wrong about that. So the number of people who are time biased in that case, it diminishes a little bit when you're forming preferences over the experiences of other people. But people who are time biased are still time biased in that sort of case. It seems like what's going on is precisely this kind of mental time travel thing, is that when you're asked about the experiences of your child having an operation here or there, I imagine that what people do, rather than taking the kind of external perspective that I think he was probably taking, okay, there's my child over there and there's either 10 hours or 1 hour. I think people are imagining themselves being that child in the hospital, and then they're sort of, from that embedded temporal perspective of the child themselves, they're thinking, well, if I were that kid, I would want to have already had the surgery, and so that's what I'm preferring on their behalf, because I'm sort of imagining things from your perspective rather than from mine. So people are still future biased or time biased on behalf of other people.
When we think about time preferences in animals, what ethical dilemmas are starting to arise when we think about how this research might actually frustrate an animal's experience of time?
Unsurprisingly, there's no data on the kind of past-future time bias in animals, because it's hard to see how you would probe that. But of course, there is more general research on time bias, which is future-directed. So other time biases are biases about where in the future you prefer stuff. Unsurprisingly, people tend to prefer to have pleasant stuff kind of temporally close and unpleasant stuff temporally far. And animals very strongly show that preference too. Animals are what we call near biased. I think that's been shown for almost all the animals that you can test.
And what's an example of this when we say, positive experience temporally close?
So here's something people do all the time. In the future case, you can actually intertemporally trade. So you can, in fact, make decisions about where in the future to have something. Let's suppose you have to have surgery for something. It can either be quite near, you can have a shorter procedure tomorrow, or you can delay the surgery and it will be like 2 years down the track, but it will be a bit longer because you've made things worse. So I guess we all do this with a dentist, right? Now, sometimes we don't know that that's what's going to happen. Sometimes we just do that in ignorance. But sometimes people know that, look, I can either do this thing tomorrow, which is going to be bad, or I can do it later and it will be worse. And even in full knowledge, people will make that choice. They'll trade off having more of a bad thing as long as it's like further away. The same is true for kind of good things, right? So people will trade away some of a good thing so that they can have more of it now and less of it later. This general pattern of what's called near bias is something that like psychologists and economists are particularly interested in, because obviously it connects to all sorts of things that are in turn connected to kind of well-being. So think about like savings and superannuation. Government is very worried about these kinds of things because the tendency to want to have your good stuff now rather than your good stuff later means that you're less inclined to save and more inclined to spend now, because the spending gets you immediate good stuff, whereas the saving would get you good stuff down the track. But even if the saving would lead you to have more good stuff, right, because of compound interest and cool stuff like that, people still prefer less of a good thing now to more of a good thing later because they're getting it now. But also there's a genuine question, which is how rational is that? If you've got a distribution of good stuff, is it rational to have less of it now compared to more of it later? And in fact, we make these decisions all the time that do these kind of trade-offs. We make these decisions and we often end up in such a way that we kind of leave ourselves long-term worse off.
Maybe relating this a little bit with doom scrolling. Does that feel familiar? Like when you're stuck in that, because you're a content creator and you're online.
I'm a content creator and a heavy content consumer as well. So I feel that time just skips by when you're scrolling through social media. They just designed it in a way with TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts. You scroll and time just goes by.
And in terms of time preference as well, like, is there a connection there, Kristie, that you can see with like when you're looking through and you're like, oh gosh, I know I need to go to bed, but right now I'm just hooked and can't wait for the next cat video.
Yeah, so I guess there are sort of connections there, which is that you're effectively rewarding the current you at the cost of the later you, right? In a way, you are kind of borrowing well-being from your future self and giving it to your current self. And there's a question about, well, is that rational? Is that a good thing to be doing? It's a non-trivial question to try and answer, right?
In gaming as well, right? 1 minute can feel like 10 minutes.
There's a whole bunch of psychologists who are working on this question, which is why is it that different temporal intervals actually feel subjectively differently lengths to people? I mean, of course, it's something we've all experienced. You might think, look, we're these evolved creatures. We should have evolved in ways that were kind of tracking time, right? It's kind of important to keep track of time in some sense. Why is it that there's this very salient way in which different temporal intervals can be experienced as differently lengthed, which is a very robust finding? The even more salient cases where like you're in a car accident and things slow down so much, it seems like 2 minutes, which is really only a few seconds. This is very clearly an experiential phenomenon because obviously it's not the case that time is really speeding up or slowing down. That will be wild, especially since different people in the same room will be experiencing things differently. They suggest that the way things seem to us is potentially fraught in various ways. Because I guess what you see from this is that, look, experiences can vary a lot in the kind of experiential aspect of time. And just imagining that time must be the way that it sort of seems to us seems like it might be quite dubious because it's very clear that time is not passing at different speeds at different places for different people. So that raises the question of like, well, how good are our intuitions and our kind of experiences as guides to what time is really like?
What does asking that question allow us to understand? Why do you think the centre of time is so interested in this?
Well, I guess we're sort of interested in figuring out who should be answering what kind of questions. So there's some questions which seem like they're obviously questions for psychologists. So the question of like, why does it seem as though time is passing more quickly under some kinds of conditions and more slowly under others? That seems like you don't go to a physicist for that because you'll just be like, what? That seems like obviously a psychology question. But there's a whole bunch of bits of question in the middle where it's kind of not clear. Is this something we should expect to find in the physics, or is this something that's explained by the way our brains work? And I think it matters how we kind of tease things apart and how we move them around. So you started this chat by talking about this way that some philosophers model time, which is this idea that there's a present moment and that there are really facts about which things are past and facts about which things are future, and we're kind of moving through time. There's a question like, what motivates that model? Well, the answer to that is that's kind of how it seems to us, right? And there really are facts about like which moment really is present, and there really are facts about what things are really past. If you take that as not something that psychologists have to worry about, but as something that physicists have to worry about, then you should be trying to capture that way things seem in your metaphysics and in your science. But if you think, no, actually that could be a psychological phenomenon, then you're not expecting to find any of that in your physical picture of the world. So really the philosophy of time is kind of divided into people who take different views about this. If you take the view that that's a kind of experiential phenomenon, you end up with a view more like mine, which doesn't have any of those features in time itself. So in my view, there is no present moment, there's no past and future, there's no movement of time.
We're in that box.
I guess that idea probably owes its origin to Einstein, and he develops general and special relativity, and from that you have Minkowski, who develops this way of modelling that in terms of a kind of four-dimensional geometry. That sort of sets the stage for various philosophical views that come later, and those views basically say, look, what is reality? Well, it is this. It's just a four-dimensional block of space-time with stuff in it. The thought is there's the three spatial dimensions. Time is just this fourth dimension that kind of runs orthogonal to those. What you get is this kind of massive block, in effect, which is, three spatial dimensions, one temporal dimension. And everything that ever happens in the universe is located somewhere in the block. So if there was a beginning to the universe, which presumably there was, Big Bang, that'll be at sort of one end of the block. The block then just contains everything else that ever is the case. So it includes all of the stuff that you and I think of as past is all out there somewhere located in space-time in a four-dimensional geometry. But interestingly, it also includes all the stuff that you and I would think of as future. So everything that ever will happen is also out there somehow stamped in space-time. The sense in which time doesn't pass is the sense in which, in that model, if you ask the question, well, where is the present moment? There's no answer to that question because there is no present moment in that sense. Wherever anyone is located, for that person, they're in the present. But there's no one moment that jumps out as being the real genuine present moment, such that everything that's prior to that is genuinely past and everything that's after that is genuinely future. Instead, all there is a completely static entity, which is a block containing all of the stuff located where they're located. And once you've told that story, that's all there is to tell. There's no sense in which time is passing, because it's not the case that You can single out certain events as present, and which events those are really changes in a way that changes which things are past and which things are future. So another way of putting that maybe is that we can still make sense of talk of past and future in that model, but they become kind of perspectival notions like up and down and left and right and south and north. It will still be true that at any location you can say, oh, the dinosaurs existed in the past. And you can say that, and it's sensible because all that really makes that true is that you have a location in the block and that the dinosaurs are located earlier in the block than where you are. So now it makes good sense to talk about them being in the past. But notice that's not a kind of transcendent fact. That's just a perspectival fact relative to where you are. So all there is to say is there's a bunch of earlier and later than relations, and what things count as being past and what things count as being future is always just relative to a location. So it's this entirely perspectival notion in the same way that left and right, north and south are. And so nothing's changing in the block.
I did hear you talk about this in terms of the time traveller. And if time travel is possible and the time traveller can head back to the dinosaurs and they change something, it's not that they've changed anything. The time traveller was always there. And I don't know if I'm doing it justice, but you had a beautiful quote that helps summarise what I would like to think of as an Indigenous philosophy of time as well. So this is taken from Kristie's own writing. What I do tomorrow makes tomorrow the way it is and the way it always has been. What I do in the past makes the past time the way it is and always has been. If I travel to the past, I am part of the past. Importantly, I was always part of the past. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. All right, that's it. Thank you, everybody. Please put your hands together for Aslan and Kristie.
On Time is a series from the Powerhouse. This conversation featured Professor Kristie Miller and Aslan Pahari and was hosted by me, Rachael Hocking. Our program curator is Bobby Vergona, and this podcast was produced, edited and sound designed by Mara Schrepp-Fager. These conversations were recorded live by Ben Rumble and Ryan Carter at the Sydney Observatory on Gadigal land. Powerhouse Head of Program is Claire Holland, Head of Digital is Callum Cooper, and the Commissioning Editor is Lisa Havilah. Special thanks to the Centre for Time and the team at Sydney Observatory. To keep up to date with the latest episodes and new content from the Powerhouse, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.